He leaned back in his chair that night, glass of whiskey catching the chandelier's glow, and smirked loud enough for every cousin, every aunt, and every hanger-on at the table to hear. "Richard still lives in that shoebox of a house," he said, his laugh sharp, cutting, rehearsed. "What's it been, 30 years? A man his age ought to have something better to show." The laughter came quickly, rolling like a tide. Some of them laughed too hard, eager to be on his side. Others laughed softly, nervously, because silence would have been noticed. I didn't laugh. I just looked down at my plate, let the candlelight flicker against the silverware, and let his words hang in the air like smoke. He always needed an audience. My cousin thrived on it. His mansion, his cars, his parties were nothing without someone standing nearby, admiring. He bought his applause. And when the clapping grew thin, he reached for mockery. I had become his favorite joke. I stirred the potatoes on my plate, listening. It was not the first time, and it would not be the last. He needed me there, the modest cousin, the one who still drove a truck with fading paint, who still lived in the same house I had bought when I was 32. My house was not big, but it was mine, bought outright with sweat and savings. He couldn't understand that. I looked across the table at him, his smile too wide, his teeth white in the light, his suit sharp as a blade. He was already drunk, but not enough to dull his cruelty. Around him, people smiled like moths to the flame, afraid to turn away. I felt the words I could have said forming in my mouth, heavy and bitter. I could have reminded him how many nights I worked with my hands, laying beams, fixing roofs, building houses while he sat in offices or brokered deals he barely understood. I could have told him that a man measures his worth not by the size of his dining room, but by the silence in which he can sleep at night. But I said none of it. Instead, I raised my glass slowly, and the silence of my gesture cut through his noise for just a second. A few eyes turned toward me. I nodded once, as if in toast, then drank. Inside, my chest felt tight, not with shame, but with something colder, something quieter. He thought I was small. He thought my house, my life, my choices made me less. But I knew something he did not. Houses, like pride, are only as strong as their foundation. And his, I had already noticed, was beginning to crack. The dinner went on. Plates were cleared, more bottles opened, laughter spilling from every corner of the great room. My cousin's mansion was built for nights like this. Vaulted ceilings, polished stone floors, chandeliers meant to drip with wealth. Everything shone, except the people. I leaned back in my chair, quiet, listening. I have always listened better than I spoke. His voice carried above all others, the host and master of ceremonies. He bragged about his collection of rare wines, about the deal he closed the week before, about the swimming pool he had heated to 78 degrees all winter. Always the numbers, always the trophies. Then, like clockwork, he turned back toward me. "You know, Richard," he said, leaning forward with that smirk that had followed him since childhood, "you should let me lend you some money. Build yourself a bigger place. That little cottage you live in, it's quaint, but it doesn't suit a man your age." A few chuckles scattered around the table, though some of the younger ones, nieces and nephews, looked uneasy. They didn't know where to look. They didn't know whether to laugh or stay quiet. They were still learning the rules of this family, the currency of ridicule. I put my fork down carefully, the metal tapping the edge of the plate. My hand did not shake. My lips did not part. I simply let the air stretch out between his comment and my silence until it was almost uncomfortable. Then I looked down again, as though I hadn't even heard him. That stung him, I could tell. A man like that needs reaction. He feeds on it. My silence was a mirror, and in it he saw himself more clearly than he liked. But still he pushed. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" The table laughed again, louder this time. I heard the sound of ice clinking in glasses, the scraping of chairs on marble. Someone whispered to someone else, but I didn't care to know what. I looked at him then, not long, just enough. His face was flushed with drink, his tie loosened, his confidence swelling, but his eyes gave him away. Behind the shine, I saw the fear of smallness, the fear of being nothing without the walls he'd bought around himself. He needed this theater. He needed me as a prop. I smiled, just a thin, tired smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes, and I let it fade as quickly as it came. That was enough. The rest of the night moved on without me. I became invisible, as I often do, and that suited me. I left before dessert, walking out into the cool night, the sound of laughter still echoing through the halls behind me. The stars were clear above the ranch land, the gravel crunching beneath my boots as I walked to my truck. My cousin's house loomed behind me, all lit up like a theater stage. It looked permanent, immovable, towering. But I knew better. I've built houses, seen walls collapse when the beams were set wrong, seen grand facades fall in storms because no one cared about what lay beneath. I climbed into the cab, turned the key, and listened to the old engine rumble awake. It was no luxury car, no imported thing polished for show. It was mine, paid for, solid. I rested my hands on the wheel and let the night sink into me. He thought I was small. He thought he'd put me in my place. But the truth was simpler. He had shown me his weakness. He had revealed to me that all his wealth, all his power, rested on a balance he couldn't keep steady. I drove home slowly, headlights cutting through the quiet country roads. My house came into view after a few miles. Small, yes, but warm. The porch light glowed faintly. The oak tree out front swayed in the breeze. The boards creaked when I stepped up onto the porch, as they always had, but they held firm. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and coffee grounds. My dog raised his head from the rug, tail thumping once before settling again. I hung my jacket on the same hook I'd been using for 30 years, sat in the same chair I'd fixed myself twice, and listened to the silence. Some people cannot stand silence. For me, it has always been a friend. In silence, I can hear the truth of things. In silence, I can wait. That night, as I sat with a single glass of whiskey cheaper than his, no doubt, but smoother on my tongue, I thought back to the way his eyes had flickered when I did not answer. I thought of how brittle he had looked behind all that golden glass, and I knew something then, though I could not yet see how it would play out. The mansion was not his strength, it was his weakness. And one day, I would prove it. I wasn't always the quiet man in the corner. There was a time when my hands were never still, when every day was marked by the sound of hammer against nail, saw against wood, sweat dripping into the grain of beams that would outlast me. I built houses for a living, not big ones, not glamorous ones. Practical homes for families who needed roofs, walls, and kitchens that wouldn't fail them when storms rolled in. I remember being 30 years old, bent over a frame in the middle of July. The sun was high, the boards hot to the touch, my shirt sticking to my back. My cousin pulled up in his car, a flashy one, even then just to sneer at the heat and dust. He leaned on the hood, grinning, and asked me why I didn't get into something easier, something that actually paid. I didn't answer then either, just went back to work. Because I knew something he never did. When you build a house, you're not just raising walls. You're putting up proof that a man's hands can carve shelter out of nothing. And when you stand back at the end of the day, aching, blistered, and sunburnt, the house doesn't laugh at you. It just stands. Solid. Silent. Those were long years. While he floated between ventures, chasing whatever glimmer caught his eye, I worked steady. I married once, when I was younger. She was kind, patient, but she grew tired of my long hours. Of the money that always went to bills and savings instead of vacations and new cars. She left. I let her go. Because a man cannot force someone to love a life they don't want. After that, I poured myself into work. I didn't spend much. I never cared for expensive clothes or shining floors. What I earned went into the mortgage, then into fixing what needed fixing, then into quiet savings that gathered dust in the bank. My house, small though it was, became mine sooner than most. Paid off before I turned 45. That was the difference between us. He bought big before he could afford it, borrowed to keep up appearances, and laughed when the numbers looked impressive. I went the other way. Build small, own it outright, let the years do the rest. But you can't explain that at a dinner table where everyone measures worth in chandeliers and imported wine. They don't see what it means to come home after a storm. Roof intact, floors dry, light still burning because you wired it yourself. They don't see the quiet pride of a man who owes no one. Instead, they see the truck with fading paint, the house with worn shingles, the shirt with frayed cuffs. They laugh because laughter is easier than understanding. And still, I stayed silent. Not because I had no answer, but because my answer would have been wasted. They would not hear it. And silence, I have always believed, is a sharper weapon than words when the time is right. I think back often to my father. He was not a wealthy man either, but he taught me something when I was a boy. I had asked him once why he never borrowed money to buy a bigger farm, why we always scraped by when neighbors flaunted new tractors, new barns. He looked at me long and steady, then said, "A man who borrows lives in another man's shadow. Better to have less in the sun than more in someone else's shade." Those words stayed. They followed me through every nail I drove, every dollar I set aside. And they stood in stark contrast to my cousin, who never met a loan he didn't like. The family never saw those differences. They only saw the surface. his feasts and my quiet dinners, his grand halls and my narrow rooms. They mistook noise for success and silence for failure. That's why his laughter cut the way it did. Not because I envied him, but because he turned my choices, my discipline, my sacrifices into a spectacle for others. He dressed up my strength as weakness. But if he had listened closely, if he had watched the way I listened instead of spoke, he might have noticed. He might have seen the cracks. Because money borrowed must be paid, taxes ignored must be collected, and walls built on sand cannot stand forever. I sat many nights in that small living room, the old cedar smell in the air, the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall, and thought of what my father had said. I thought of how right he had been. And though I had no plan yet, no revenge shaped or sharpened, I knew one truth with certainty. Time would show who had built on rock and who on sand. And I could wait. My cousin's rise looked dazzling from the outside. People admired him, envied him, toasted him. I watched it all unfold from a distance, and sometimes from the same table where he boasted. He started in real estate, though he never lifted a hammer or measured a beam in his life. He was good at charm, at convincing people he was sharper than he really was. Banks liked him because he borrowed big, and for a while, he paid back big. He flipped houses, built partnerships, played at being a visionary. And when the money rolled in, he spent it faster than it came. I remember the first time he invited me to his new place. It was hardly finished then, just marble floors echoing underfoot, paint still drying on the walls. But he walked me through it like a king showing off his castle. He pointed at the ceilings, the imported chandeliers, the heated pool, the grand staircase that curved for no reason other than to impress. "Now this is living, Richard," he said, grinning, his voice bouncing off the bare walls. "You could have this too if you stopped living so small. Why settle for less?" I didn't answer, just let my hand rest on the polished banister. The wood was smooth, glossy, but beneath it, I saw the seams of rushed carpentry, corners cut where no one would notice until years later. It was beautiful, yes, but not solid. That was the difference between us. He built for applause. I built for permanence. Over the years, his parties grew louder, his cars shinier, his laughter sharper. He made sure the family saw the spread tables groaning with food, champagne flowing, music spilling out into the night. People who never returned his calls before now lined up to shake his hand. And me? I stayed where I was. Quiet house, old truck, the same steady routine. Sometimes I caught the sideways glances from family, the pitying smiles, the whispered questions. Why hadn't I remarried? Why hadn't I expanded my business? Why hadn't I moved up like my cousin? They never asked what I valued. They only measured what they could see. But I saw the cracks. Each year his debts grew. He had to borrow to maintain the image. The mansion was not just a home. It was a hungry mouth, swallowing taxes, repairs, staff, and bills. He kept feeding it with loans, refinancing, juggling credit, always one step behind the truth. At family gatherings, he never admitted it, of course. He only turned the spotlight on me. My small house, my quiet life. He made sure others laughed before they could question him. That's how men like him survive, by making someone else the smaller shadow. I'll admit, sometimes it stung. Sometimes on quiet nights, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee and wondered if maybe they were right. Maybe I should have wanted more, chased more, proved more. My cousin's voice lingered, mocking even when he wasn't there. But then I'd look at the oak tree out front, planted the year I moved in. Its roots had pushed deep into the soil, its branches stretching steady and wide. It didn't grow fast, but it grew strong. And that, I reminded myself, was the kind of life I wanted. Still, his words had weight. Because words, once spoken, don't disappear. They stick to you, even if you try to brush them off. And every time he mocked me, every time the family laughed along, a stone settled quietly in my chest. I didn't throw the stones back. I carried them, patiently. And over the years, they built something inside me. Not anger, exactly. Not bitterness either. Something colder, steadier. Something waiting. It was at his 50th birthday party when I first realized the house would one day undo him. The place was lit up like a palace, music pounding through every wall, laughter spilling out into the night. He gave a speech that night, standing on the balcony, glass raised high. "To family," he shouted, "and to living large." The crowd cheered, glasses clinked. And then he turned, eyes finding me in the corner, as though he couldn't resist. "And to Richard, who still lives in that little cottage of his, may he finally build himself a real house someday." Laughter again, It rolled like thunder, practiced, rehearsed. I smiled, thin and patient. But while they laughed, my eyes drifted past him, past the glittering lights and loud music, to the shadows at the edge of the estate. The grounds were wide, but unkempt. Fences sagged where no one noticed, the driveway cracked near the end where headlights didn't reach. I saw what others ignored, the places where maintenance had been postponed, where money had been stretched too thin. That was the night I knew. One day he wouldn't be able to keep up with it. One day, the mansion would eat him alive. And when it did, I wouldn't have to say a word. Because silence, like debt, compounds over time. The worst of it came on a summer evening when the air was thick with the smell of barbecued meat and the buzz of cicadas in the grass. My cousin was hosting another of his endless gatherings. He had a way of making even birthdays that weren't his own into spectacles centered around him. That night it was meant to celebrate an aunt's 75th. But, as usual, the house became his stage. The great room was crowded, glasses clinking, the chandelier blazing. I stood near the back, as I often did, content to watch and let the noise wash over me. My cousin thrived at the center. He circled the room with a grin that never wavered, clapping shoulders, pouring drinks, laughing too loud at jokes that weren't funny. And then he saw me. He always saw me. "Richard," he called out, his voice rising above the music. "Come here, cousin. Don't hide back there. Everyone, let me introduce you properly." The crowd turned. Dozens of eyes landed on me. I set my glass down slowly, walked forward through the parting bodies, and stood beside him. He threw an arm around my shoulder, his cologne thick and expensive, his grip firm like a man showing off a prize. "This here," he announced, "is my cousin Richard. Salt of the earth, the hardest working man I know. Built half the houses in this county with his own two hands. And yet," he paused for effect, letting the hush spread, "he still lives in the same little shack he bought 30 years ago." The laughter broke fast, sharp, and loud. It rippled through the room like a fire catching dry grass. Some of them looked at me with pity, others with amusement, but none with respect. They laughed because he had given them permission to laugh. I felt the heat rise in my face, though my expression did not change. My cousin's smile grew wider. He leaned in close, his breath hot at my ear, and whispered just loud enough for me to hear. "You'll never know what it means to live big, cousin. You'll die in that box of a house, and the world will never notice." He pulled back, raising his glass high again, while the others followed, still chuckling, still watching. I stood in silence. My heart beat steady, though each word had landed heavy. I looked around at the crowd family, supposed family, and saw in their faces what he had planted there. They believed him. They saw me as the shadow, the small man, the quiet man who hadn't made it. I smiled faintly, the kind of smile that doesn't move the eyes, and I let it fade as quickly as it appeared. Then I stepped back, away from his arm, away from the circle of laughter, and returned to the corner where I belonged. I could have left then, walked out into the night and driven home. But I stayed. I stayed because silence, to me, is not retreat. It is patience. And I wanted to see the performance play out to its end. As the night wore on, I watched him strut through his mansion, watched him point out his collections, his imported wines, his new car parked out front. I watched the guests nod and flatter and feed his hunger for admiration. And I noticed too the things they didn't see: the unpaid bills tucked on a desk in his study, half hidden under magazines, the corners of the property where weeds crept up, the slight cracks in plaster along the ceiling where the house was already shifting. He had built his castle on shifting sand, and though the crowd could not see it, I could. Later, as I stood on the balcony alone, the laughter echoing behind me, I thought of my father again. His words came back with weight. Better to have less in the sun than more in someone else's shade. My cousin's wealth was all shade, a canopy held up by credit and arrogance. That was the night I stopped doubting. For years, his mockery had felt like stones thrown at me, each one bruising but not breaking. That night, the stones hardened into something else, a foundation. He wanted me small. He wanted me humiliated, and he had succeeded for the moment. But humiliation, like silence, can ferment. It can turn into something sharp, something patient, something inevitable. I left the mansion after midnight. The laughter followed me down the drive, fading as the gates closed behind my truck. The road stretched dark and quiet ahead of me. I drove slow, the cool air coming through the open window, the stars bright above. By the time I reached my house, my small, steady house with its worn porch and familiar oak tree, the humiliation had settled into something calmer, something colder. It wasn't anger. Anger burns too fast. No, it was something else. The certainty that one day the balance would shift. That one day he would choke on the very grandeur he had used to mock me. And when that day came, I wouldn't have to say a word. When I got home that night, the house was dark except for the lamp I always left on near the porch. The boards creaked under my boots, and for a moment I stood there in the quiet, letting the night press against me. The echoes of laughter still clung to my ears, sharper than the cicadas in the grass. Inside, the air was cool and familiar. My dog lifted his head from the rug, blinked at me once, and settled back down. I hung my jacket on its hook, loosened my collar, and sat in the old armchair that had molded itself to me over decades. I didn't pour myself a drink. I didn't need one. The taste of humiliation was already bitter enough. I replayed the scene over and over, his hand heavy on my shoulder, his grin wide, the laughter of the room like a chorus rehearsed for years. I thought of the pity in some eyes, the amusement in others, and I thought of the words he'd whispered, his voice sharp with triumph. You'll die in that box of a house, and the world will never notice. For a long while, I sat in silence, staring at the wall, listening to the faint tick of the clock. His words settled like dust on old wood, coating everything, impossible to brush off. But then, as the minutes passed, the sting dulled. Not because it hurt less, but because hurt has always been a teacher to me. And what it taught me that night was simple. My silence had not been enough. For years, I thought ignoring him was victory. That by staying quiet, by living on my own terms, I had already proven him wrong. But humiliation is different. Humiliation demands an answer. Not a loud one, not an angry one, but an answer all the same. And so, as I sat there in that small living room with its worn rug and cedar walls, I felt something shift. The stones of every insult, every slight, every laugh at my expense, they settled into place. They formed a foundation I hadn't realized I was building. I thought back to when we were boys. He was always the one who ran ahead, who wanted to be first, who needed others to see him. I was the one who stayed behind, who worked quietly, who didn't mind being unseen. That had never changed. But now, I realized his need to be seen was his weakness, and my ability to remain unseen, to move quietly, to wait was my strength. I stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the oak tree. Its branches swayed gently in the night breeze. I had planted it the year I moved in, when I was young, and still believed life would unfold steady and simple. Its roots had sunk deep, unseen, while the world above shifted with storms and seasons. That tree had outlasted so much already. I touched the window frame, the wood cool beneath my palm, and I thought of my cousin's mansion, so large, so loud, so fragile. A house fed by ego, not roots. A house built to be admired, not to endure. And I thought of the bills I had glimpsed on his desk, the cracks in his walls, the small signs others had ignored. Signs I could not ignore, because I had spent a lifetime building and repairing. I knew the language of houses, and his house was speaking loud and clear, even if no one else could hear it. The humiliation of that night did not break me. It clarified me. From that moment, I stopped wondering whether he was right. I stopped measuring myself by his words, his laughter, his grand rooms filled with borrowed glory. Instead, I began to watch more closely, to listen more carefully, to let his noise wash over me while I looked beneath the surface. I said nothing to anyone, not to the family, not to the neighbors, not to the men I still played cards with on Saturdays. My silence became more than patience now. It became preparation, because I knew something he did not. One day, the mansion would demand a price he could not pay, and when that day came, I would be there. Not with laughter, not with ridicule, not with cruel words whispered in his ear. I would be there with silence, with action. I sat back down in my chair, the old spring sighing under me, and I felt the bitterness turn into something steadier, something colder. It was no longer about defending myself, no longer about enduring. It was about waiting for the inevitable and being ready when it arrived. And it would arrive. I closed my eyes, the hum of the night filling the room, and let myself drift into sleep. The laughter still echoed faintly in the distance of my memory, but it no longer stung. It only reminded me of what was coming. Because humiliation may feel like defeat in the moment, but for a man who knows how to wait, it is only the beginning. It started small. Most things do. I was at his house one afternoon not by choice, but because family obligations have a way of dragging you into places you'd rather not be. My aunt had asked me to pick up a box of old photographs she'd left in his study. He was out at the time, so one of the staff let me in. The study was grand, like the rest of the house, dark wood shelves lined with books he never read, leather chairs that creaked more from neglect than use. But on the desk, under a stack of glossy magazines, I noticed envelopes. Thin, official, stamped with the county seal. I didn't touch them. Didn't need to. The red ink on the front said enough. Delinquent property tax notice. I stood there for a moment, the weight of the room pressing in. The laughter from those dinners echoed in my mind, the sting of humiliation sharp again. And now, in front of me, lay the first crack in his fortress. I left the photographs where they were and walked out without a word. But the image of those envelopes stayed with me. Weeks later, I returned for another family gathering. I made a point of drifting near the study again. The envelopes were still there, only now the stack was thicker, the red ink brighter. That's when I knew the mansion was bleeding him dry. I didn't act immediately. That's not my way. Instead, I began to pay attention. I watched the cars that came and went from his driveway. I noticed the staff thinning fewer gardeners, fewer cleaners. I listened at dinners when he boasted, and beneath the laughter I caught the strain in his voice, the slight hesitation before he rattled off his latest purchase. A man like him could fake wealth for a long time, but not forever. At night, I began looking at county records. Public information, available to anyone willing to search. It was all there in black and white. The overdue taxes, the fines, the liens. Each line on the page was a crack spreading deeper through the foundation of his empire. I didn't feel joy. Not yet. What I felt was a cold certainty, the kind that settles in your bones. He had mocked me for living small. He had laughed at my house, my truck, my silence. But while he was busy feeding his appetite for admiration, I had built something else. Freedom. No debt, no liens, no taxman knocking at my door. He had mistaken my modesty for weakness. He had mistaken my silence for emptiness. But silence is not empty. Silence listens. Silence waits. I said nothing to anyone. Not to my aunt, not to my cousins, not to the neighbors who still admired his mansion from afar. I kept the knowledge close, tucked away like a tool waiting for the right job. And in the meantime, I lived my life as I always had. My mornings were quiet, my evenings steady. I fixed what needed fixing, tended to my garden, played cards on Saturdays. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, everything had. Each time I drove past his mansion, I looked at it differently. Not as a fortress that dwarfed my small house, but as a crumbling monument. Beautiful on the outside, hollow within. I could almost hear the timbers groaning under the weight of unpaid bills. He didn't see it, of course. Men like him rarely do until it's too late. He still threw his parties, though they grew smaller, the champagne cheaper, the laughter thinner. He still called attention to me whenever I was there, mocking, reminding everyone of the shoebox I lived in. I let him, because every word he spoke, every insult he threw, only made the silence I was holding sharper. And then came the night when, passing his desk again on some errand, I saw a different envelope, not just a notice, but a final demand, a warning of foreclosure. I stood there in the dim light of the study, the paper trembling slightly in the air from the ceiling fan above, and I felt no pity, no anger, no triumph, only inevitability. The house he worshipped was slipping from his hands, and soon the county would take it. When that happened, there would be an auction, and at that auction, someone would buy what he could no longer afford. I already knew who. After that night in the study, everything sharpened. The laughter of the family, the shine of the chandeliers, the sneer in my cousin's voice, all of it faded into background noise. What stayed clear were the numbers, the debts, the notices, the inevitable end inching closer. I knew better than to rush. Rushing is what ruins a foundation. I had spent a lifetime building slowly, carefully. This would be no different. So I started where I always start, with research. County tax records are open to anyone willing to look. Most people don't bother. I did. In the evenings when the house was quiet and the dog asleep at my feet, I combed through them, line after line, notice after notice. The mansion's debt wasn't just late, it was compounding. Penalties stacked like bricks, one atop the other, heavy enough to crush even a man who thought himself untouchable. I kept a notebook, plain and worn, where I wrote it all down. Dates, amounts, warnings. I tracked the pattern, watched the story unfold, not through gossip or rumor, but through hard ink and paper. His fortress was rotting from the inside. At the same time, I spoke quietly with a man I knew at the courthouse. We'd played cards together for years. He never asked why I was curious, and I never told him. But over a few games and a few modest wagers, I learned what I needed to know about tax sales, foreclosure auctions, and the timelines involved. It wasn't complicated, really. When the taxes weren't paid, the county would eventually take possession and sell the property to the highest bidder. Most people at those auctions were investors, looking for a quick profit. Few were prepared to actually own and manage a house that size. That gave me an advantage. I began to prepare my finances, quietly, methodically. I had savings untouched for years. Enough, with care, to make a move when the time came. And unlike my cousin, I didn't owe anyone a cent. No debts, no liens. My modest life, mocked and pitied, had given me exactly what I needed now, freedom to act. Still, I told no one. Not my friends, not the few family members I still trusted. Revenge, if you want to call it that, only works when it arrives without warning. And silence has always been my truest ally. The months passed, and the signs grew clearer. His parties grew smaller, his boasts thinner. Once I overheard him talking about selling one of his cars to streamline things. He framed it as strategy, but I could hear the strain in his voice. Meanwhile, I kept listening, watching, waiting. I drove past the county courthouse on mornings when I had no other reason to be there, just to see the notices posted. Each time, the list of properties in arrears grew longer, and each time his address was there. It was like watching a great oak rot from within. On the outside, it still stood tall, branches wide, leaves green. But I knew the core was hollowing. All it needed was time. One evening, as I sat on my porch, I thought of the irony. For years, he had mocked me for living small, for not keeping up. And yet, it was my very smallness, my steady, unassuming life that had left me ready for this. He had spent his fortune on appearances. I had spent my years building silence into strength. And so, when the notice finally came, the official announcement of the tax auction, I was ready. I read the words slowly, letting them settle. The property, my cousin's pride and joy. The stage for every insult, every laugh, every humiliation would be up for sale. I closed the paper, set it on the table beside me, and leaned back in my chair. The night was quiet, the oak tree swaying gently, the dog asleep at my feet. For the first time in years, I allowed myself a smile. Not a laugh, not a boast, not a performance. Just a quiet smile in the dark, unseen by anyone. Because the moment I had been waiting for was finally coming. And when it did, I wouldn't raise my voice. I wouldn't mock him or remind him of his words. I would simply raise my hand at the auction, and the silence would do the rest. The day of the auction was bright, though the air carried a stillness that felt almost ceremonial. I parked my truck a block away from the courthouse, the same truck he'd mocked countless times. Its paint was faded, the seat covers worn, but the engine still turned over steady, like a heart that knew its rhythm. I walked into the courthouse quietly, unnoticed among the crowd of bidders and onlookers. Most were dressed sharp, investors with their polished shoes and expensive watches, whispering about profit margins. I wore my usual flannel and jacket. Nobody paid me any mind. That suited me fine. The room smelled faintly of old wood and dust, the hum of fluorescent lights above. A clerk shuffled papers at the front, calling each property in turn. I listened, patient, as the list moved closer to the one I had come for. And then it came, the mansion, my cousin's castle. The pride he had flaunted, the stage for every insult. The clerk read out the address, the overdue taxes, the opening bid. A hush passed through the room. This wasn't just another small parcel or foreclosed shop. This was a mansion, a headline kind of property. Eyes lit up, whispers spread. Investors sat forward in their seats. The bidding began. Numbers rose quickly at first, eager hands pushing the price higher. But as the amounts grew heavier, some dropped out. The hesitation spread like a ripple, one bidder after another lowering their gaze, shaking their head. I waited. When the numbers slowed, when the room grew tense and quiet, I lifted my hand, just once. Calm, certain. The clerk nodded, called out the figure, waited for a counter. None came. The silence stretched, thick and final. Then the gavel came down with a crack that echoed through the room. Sold. That was it. No fanfare, no applause, just a single word, spoken in the dry air of the courthouse, but to me, it carried the weight of years. I had bought the mansion, quietly, simply, without a word. When I walked out into the sunlight, the papers folded neatly in my pocket. I paused on the steps. The world looked the same, cars passing, birds calling, the courthouse clock ticking steady. But inside, something had shifted. The house that had been his fortress, his throne, his weapon against me, was mine now. Bought not with arrogance, not with borrowed money, but with the steady patience of a life lived within my means. I didn't rush to the mansion that day. I didn't need to. Instead, I drove home first. Saturday on my porch with a cup of coffee, the oak tree swaying overhead. I let the silence wash through me, the truth settling slow. Later, when I did drive to the property, I didn't announce myself. I pulled into the long driveway as though nothing had changed. But at the gates, the staff looked at me differently. They had already heard. News like that travels fast in houses like his. Inside, the hall still gleamed. The chandeliers still burned. But the air felt hollow, as if the house itself knew it no longer belonged to him. I found him in the study. He was seated behind the desk, papers scattered before him, his face drawn in ways I had never seen. The grin was gone, the confidence drained. He looked up when I entered, his eyes narrowing, confusion flickering into recognition. "You?" he asked, his voice rough, as though he hadn't spoken in hours. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He leaned back in his chair, laughter breaking from him suddenly, bitter and sharp. "So this is your revenge? You buy my house? What do you think this proves, Richard? That you're better than me?" I stood there, steady, my hands resting at my sides. His words washed over me like wind over stone. "You'll never fill this place," he spat. "You'll never be me." I let the silence grow between us until even he could feel it pressing in. Then, finally, I spoke. My voice was low, calm, unshaken. "I never wanted to be you. That was all. No lecture, no gloating, no cruelty, just the truth." And in that truth, he saw at the depth of his own defeat. Not because I had shouted louder or laughed harder, but because I had waited, because I had endured, because the house he thought made him bigger had been undone by the very silence he mocked. I left him there in the study, his world crumbling around him. When I stepped back outside, the evening light stretched long across the grounds. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and summer dust. I stood for a moment, letting it sink in. The mansion was mine now. But more than that, the silence was mine. The weeks after the auction were quieter than I expected. No grand confrontations, no shouting at courthouse steps, just a slow, steady, unraveling, the kind of collapse that doesn't come with a bang, but with a long, defeated sigh. I didn't rush him out. The paperwork allowed him time, and I let it be. It was not cruelty to watch him pack up his life. It was consequence, and consequences don't need to be hurried. Each time I drove past the mansion in those weeks, I saw the signs. Fewer cars in the drive. Windows dark where chandeliers once blazed. A help-wanted sign pulled from the gate, never replaced. Slowly, the great house that had roared with music and laughter sank into silence. Neighbors whispered, family whispered louder. Some called me to ask if it was true, if I had really bought it. I confirmed nothing. Silence was still my answer. Let them wonder. Let them piece it together themselves. And my cousin? He didn't call. He couldn't. Pride is a stubborn thing, even when it's crumbling. It was a Sunday afternoon when I saw him leave for the last time. I was parked at a distance, down the road, half hidden beneath the shade of an elm. His car, one of the few he had left, was stuffed with boxes, the trunk tied shut with a rope. He drove slowly, not with his usual swagger, but with the weary weight of someone who knows the road ahead is narrower than the one behind. For a moment, I almost pitied him. Almost. But then I remembered the dinners, the laughter, the whispers meant to cut me down in front of everyone. I remembered the way his hand had pressed on my shoulder as he told the room I would die in a box of a house. No, pity was too generous. What I felt instead was a kind of solemn justice, a balance restored. I didn't wave when he passed, didn't honk my horn or step out to be seen. I let him go as quietly as I had lived. A week later, I walked the mansion's halls as its rightful owner. The air was different now. No voices, no music, just the faint echo of my own steps on marble floors. The chandeliers hung above me, catching the afternoon light, but they felt less like trophies and more like relics. I paused in the dining room where so many insults had been served to me alongside his feasts. I could still see their faces in my mind, the way they laughed, the way they looked at me like I was less. But the room was empty now. Their laughter had no place here anymore. I stood at the head of the long table, let my hand rest on the polished wood, and breathed in the silence. There is a power in standing where someone once humiliated you, not to gloat, not to sneer, but simply to exist, to be. Later that evening, family began to call again, some with curiosity, some with thinly veiled awe. A cousin asked me outright how it happened. I told him only, it was available and I bought it. Nothing more. Let them fill the silence with their own conclusions. In time, the whispers turned into respect. Quiet respect, the kind no one dares to say too loudly, but which shows in the way they pause before speaking my name now. As for my cousin, he disappeared from gatherings altogether. Word reached me he was renting a modest apartment in town, working odd jobs to keep the bills paid. The man who once sneered at my small house now lived in something smaller than mine. I never visited, never gloated, never sought him out. Revenge, if you want to call it that, had already been served, and it needed no seasoning of cruelty. The house was mine. The silence was mine. The dignity was mine. One evening, I sat on the balcony, the sun setting over the grounds, the air turning cool. I thought of all the years I had endured the jokes, the mockery, the laughter, and I realized that every moment of humiliation had been a stone laid in the foundation of this very silence. He had mocked me for living small, but in the end it was his bigness, his hunger for grandeur, his need for applause that destroyed him. I sipped my coffee slowly, the light fading, and let the silence stretch out into the night. This was never about having more. It was about proving without a word that living small had always been enough. The mansion felt different once the dust settled. For years, it had been a stage, a theater for his laughter, a weapon aimed at me across candlelit tables. But now, stripped of its audience, it was only a house. On my first morning there, I walked the halls alone. The air carried no perfume of rich colognes, no clinking of glasses, no music bouncing from the chandeliers, just silence. Pure, steady silence. I paused in each room, letting my hand brush along the polished surfaces, the marble counters, the heavy curtains, the oak banister curling up the grand staircase. All of it had been chosen for show, for spectacle, and yet, without an audience, it looked almost tired, like a grand actor with no play left to perform. I didn't feel triumphant, not in the way people expect revenge to feel. There was no rush of glory, no shout of victory. What I felt was something quieter, deeper, a weight lifted, a balance restored. In the study, I stood where he had once whispered his cruelest words into my ear. The desk was still there, though emptied of his scattered bills. I lowered myself into the chair and leaned back. The leather sighed beneath me. For the first time, I was the one seated here. But I didn't smirk. I didn't sneer. I simply sat, calm, steady, present. Sometimes, revenge is not about flipping the script. Sometimes, it's about erasing it altogether. I thought of the family then, of their laughter, their whispers, their sideways glances. Word had spread, of course. They knew the mansion was mine now. Some avoided the subject. Others asked questions with hesitant voices, but none laughed anymore. I didn't invite them to celebrate. I didn't throw open the doors to show off. That wasn't why I was here. The house didn't need to be a stage anymore. It could simply be a roof, walls, a place of quiet. At night, I sat on the balcony with a cup of coffee, the ground stretching out beneath me. The air smelled of grass and stone cooling under the dark. The stars were sharp above, unbothered by the noise of men. From up there, I could see the road where I used to drive away, humiliated, after his parties. The same road where I once clenched the wheel and swallowed the laughter that had followed me. Now, the road stretched silent and empty, carrying no echo but my own steady breath. It struck me then that silence had been the thread all along. Silence when I built houses under the sun. Silence when my marriage ended quietly, without scandal. Silence when he mocked me year after year. And silence too when I raised my hand at the auction and claimed the house. Silence had carried me here. And silence was what would keep me steady long after the laughter had gone. I thought of him, living in some small apartment now, stripped of the grandeur he once worshipped. Did he remember the words he'd said to me? Did he recall the weight of his hand on my shoulder? The roar of laughter around us? Perhaps. Perhaps not. But either way, the silence I carried was louder than any memory. I rose from the chair, walked through the dim halls, and opened the front doors. The night air rushed in, cool and clean. I stepped onto the porch and let my hand rest on the heavy doorframe. For the first time, I felt no trace of the insults, no echo of humiliation. The house was no longer his. It was no longer tied to laughter or cruelty. It was simply mine, not as a prize, but as proof. Proof that silence endures where noise crumbles. I closed the doors gently behind me. Revenge, I realized, is not about making them feel what you felt. It's about showing them, without a word, that what they thought was weakness was strength all along. And as I walked back through the quiet halls, I felt it settle into me like stone into a foundation. Dignity does not need applause. It only needs silence. The mansion grew quieter as the months passed, and I let it. I didn't try to fill it with people or noise. I lived in it as I had lived in my small house, steady, simple, unassuming. A man doesn't need chandeliers to light his evenings. A single lamp will do. Sometimes I walk the halls at night, the echo of my footsteps reminding me of the emptiness that used to intimidate me when the house was his. Back then, each gleaming surface seemed like a mirror held up to my so-called smallness. Now, they were just walls, just wood and stone. A man can live in a cottage or a castle. It makes no difference if he carries his dignity within him. The family tried, now and then, to make conversation about it. At gatherings, someone would glance my way, lower their voice, and murmur about how impressive it was that I had managed to take possession of the mansion. I let their words drift past me like smoke. I neither confirmed nor denied, neither basked nor explained. Because the truth is, revenge spoken loses its weight. Revenge explained is no revenge at all. I never sought my cousin out. I never knocked on his new door or reminded him of what had happened. I didn't need to. The silence between us said everything that words never could. He knew, and I knew he knew. That was enough. Sometimes, on quiet mornings, I stood at the balcony with my coffee and looked out across the grounds. I thought of him standing there once, glass raised high, the laughter of the crowd behind him, my name a punchline. I remembered how small I felt in that moment. And then I remembered the courthouse, the weight of the papers in my hand, the sound of the gavel declaring the house mine. No crowd, no applause, just silence. That was the better moment. That was the stronger one. The oak tree outside my old house still grows, its roots pushing deeper, its branches wider. I visit sometimes, drive by the modest porch, stand in the yard. The new owners keep it tidy. It warms me to see the tree thriving, to know it still shades the same soil I once tended. That house was never a box, no matter what he said. It was a foundation. It gave me everything I needed to endure until the right time came. And now, standing in the mansion he once lorded over me, I see the truth clear. What he thought was my weakness was my strength. What he mocked as smallness was the very thing that outlasted him. I don't smile when I think of it. I don't laugh. I simply breathe easier. Because in the end, the loudest voice is not the one that shouts or mocks. It's the one that waits, that listens, that endures. And when the waiting is done, when the silence finally speaks, it does so with a weight no laughter can carry. So I sit now in these quiet halls, a man not larger, not smaller, simply whole. My cousin mocked me for living small. But when the taxes came due, when the laughter faded, when the silence settled, it was I who owned his mansion. Not because I needed it, not because I wanted his stage, but because silence had always been mine. And silence, in the end, is the most unshakable revenge.